My name is Claire Edmonds, and I am a facilitator at Wellspring, a program developer. I work predominantly with the Healing Journey program, but I do other things too. I train professionals. I train volunteers, one of the biggest pleasures of my work. And I have coped with cancer personally 2 times, different diseases, different treatments, different experiences. And so when it comes to hope, I'm not going to be coming from a theoretical perspective. I'm going to be coming from a personal perspective. And I'm going to be sharing personal stories, because that, to me, is the way we begin to explore hope. Because I think hope is a feeling. I think hope emerges out of what we experience. And I know it's a rather funny title, Hope with or Without Feathers, but I'll get to why why we use that as the title. This is a lovely time of year to be talking about hope. It seems to me that springtime embodies hope in so many ways. And I'm hoping that wherever you are in the country, you have a beautiful day. Here in Toronto, I think it's really the first day that feels like full-on spring. So we have a sense of hope rekindled, spring flowers, green leaves. I have a rather large groundhog who's busy chewing something in my garden, so I'm going to ignore him. We begin to feel that sense of energy, the earth's energy returning. Emily Dickinson, a poet, entreats us to view hope as a thing with feathers, delicate, tender, but enduring. So this is going to be today an exploration of hope, how it feels, where we might find it, and maybe most importantly, how to kindle it. We're also going to discuss how feelings of peace and safety can be found in the moment, as well as in the projection of our desires for the future. So I hope you've tuned into the talk that you were expecting. Let's start. So sometimes when we're struggling to understand the concept, it's helpful to know what the world thinks about it. And the dictionary is not a bad place to start. It's to cherish a desire with anticipation, to want something to happen or to be true. Now, I think the second term is really interesting, because I'm going to come back to this, the idea of trust, and to desire with expectation of attainment or fulfillment. How does it relate to us coping with cancer? In my experience, hope kind of travels with us. It morphs, it changes. In the very beginning, often when investigations are starting, the hope is that it's not cancer. And then when that is verified, that it is indeed, I hope there is treatment. I hope the surgery goes well. I hope I don't need chemo or radiation. That's really interesting, because I'm having a memory of thinking to myself, I don't think I need chemo at the doctor's appointment. I think I heard her say, I don't think you'll need chemo. It was really interesting, because my husband heard, I think you're going to need chemo. So sometimes hope can change how we hear things. And then when I found out I didn't need chemo, I can really remember that transition between, all right, so I need chemo. I hope I can cope with it well. I hope I can find the resources to help me cope with it. So it's a very lived experience. I hope I can live a long life. I hope I can be here for weddings and grandchildren. Oh, I hope it's not metastatic. I hope there's treatment for the chronic cancer. I hope I can enjoy life. I'm sure there are many, many, many other hopes. And sometimes the hopes are big, and sometimes the hopes are really quite little. So it's important maybe for us to think about that. Where has hope traveled with me? How have I found hope? So let's go back to Emily Dickinson. She's a poet, was a poet, and she wrote charming short poems, often based in nature. A little bit mysterious, I think. And she's written a beautiful one. She'd written a beautiful one about hope, which is what brings us here today. She says that hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. Hope can come from some of the strangest sources, and that, I think, is part of our experience of it. Sometimes we can be surprised. Dickinson sees hope as part of our spirituality, part of our soul. And it provides this comfort in the fiercest of storms, moments of feeling lost and frightened. And this source of strength never asks anything of us. And I believe that Dickinson is, in many ways, describing grace. Effortless, as in she moves with grace. Honoring, gracing us with his presence. Courteous goodwill, he accepted her criticisms with grace. In terms of spirituality, grace is often thought of as the benevolence that God holds to all of us, even those who might be considered by others as unworthy. Forgiveness of shortcomings. In Judaism, it's similar, an unmerited divine assistance, something that comes kind of out of the blue, a virtue coming from God, kindness, courtesy, thoughtfulness. The word in Hebrew is chen. Maybe in Emily Dickinson's perspective, the biggest challenge for us is to be able to accept these moments of grace. And I think maybe that's where the work belongs for us, believing that we are worthy of grace. And perhaps sometimes we need to learn to accept it. And maybe that's where the work begins, learning to accept grace when we are scared, when we're frightened. So that sounds like a passive concept, but perhaps not. Maybe it requires an allowing for it to unfold when we need it. And where do we find it? Well, that's an important part of our exploration together today. And perhaps we need to start with how hope feels. When have you experienced it? What was happening around you? When I think of hope coming to me as grace, I think of that thing with feathers. I'm reminded of my father. He had been told that the cancer in the muscle of his arm had moved, metastasized to his lung. I knew all too well what this meant. And I was really sad in the physician's office to watch the meaning of this sink into my parents' awareness. The oncologist said that surgery would be a good choice. I remember very distinctly asking my father not to ask for how long he had. I was really fearful that he'd mark it on his calendar. He's that kind of guy. We went home, and just like today, it was a beautiful spring day, but I remember how cold I felt. My hands were cold. My heart, deep, deep in my heart, was cold and fearful. My parents are British. This is receiving bad news. My parents are British, so there's only one thing to be done in these difficult circumstances, and of course that is to make a pot of tea. this looks like lemonade, but meant to be tea. And so I brought out the tray of tea and mugs out to the patio where we sat in the sun. And I remember trying to warm up, cradling that mug of tea in my hands, trying to warm my hands. And we were silent. I think each of us caught up in our own thoughts and feelings. We weren't talking. But suddenly we noticed a chipmunk. I'm not sure that's a chipmunk. I think that's a squirrel. But you know the kind, the ones with little stripes down their side. They're very small, very shy. They don't come out often. And this chipmunk slowly emerged from under a bush and scampered to the seeds that had fallen from the bird feeder onto the patio floor. We'd been so quiet it had hardly noticed us, and it felt safe to appear. And then we noticed birds beginning to flock at the bird feeder, a pair of cardinals and a family of sparrows that had come to the same feeder for generations through the seasons. It was quiet. It was warm. And we felt at peace, a deep peace. I smiled at my parents and we commented on the spring flowers and the soft breeze, and I think we felt safe. Safe in the arms of love. Safe in the breeze. Safe in nature. Feeling gratitude. And perhaps at some level, letting what will be. And knowing that we would manage together whatever was needed. And to me, that was grace and hope and that small thing with feathers. 10 years later after that diagnosis, my father asked what his odds of survival were, and he was told 1 to 3% for 5 years. And now some 20 years later, he's still cancer-free. So much more than we could have ever hoped for. And so what happened in that garden? Where did the hope come from? From being still, not thinking, letting go. Letting go of the planning and the panic, letting the beauty of the garden and the warmth and the familiarity of the tea and company sink into our awareness. We allowed the grace of the moment into our awareness and we sank into it. Now, did this have anything to do with my father's remarkable recovery? Likely not. That was luck, I think, and excellent medical care. And a loving family and support may be a part of it, or it may not be. Grace has a large element of mystery to it as well. And similarly, I remember when I was waiting for a phone call to schedule the biopsy when I was told that a mammogram had discovered cancer in my breast. And I needed to wait for the machinery of the hospital to roll to get me that appointment for the biopsy. I was terrified. And I was stressed, waiting. I would call the nurses sometimes and leave a message asking them if my name was still in the queue, trying to be polite, leaving a really polite message, trying not to be too obsequious. I had prayed over that phone. I had written imaginary letters to them. I raged at the system because waiting is really hard. So very, very hard and absolutely exhausting. And so at some point in frustrated desperation of hoping that the next call would be from them, I went into the garden. And again, it was spring. And I sat and I breathed long, deep breaths. And eventually I noticed the perfume of lilac, peonies, and the scent of green grass. And I breathed some more in a way to extinguish the burning thoughts and embers of panic in my heart. And each breath brought a slightly rocking movement to my body. And I began to let go. I began to stop thinking. I stopped negotiating, bargaining, betting. In essence, I stopped hoping for the call and I gave up and just let go into trust. Of course, they would call. There was a process that they had to go through, that I had to go through, and it would unfold. Stop forcing, pushing, and let it go, at least for the moment. And the panic died down and something shifted, and I was okay. And in due course, the phone call came and the process proceeded. So that may be another element to hope, and that is trust. Trusting that the call will come, that the surgeons will be skilled, and that there are people who know what to do next. What would it be like to let go and trust? I remember having that feeling with my surgeons, that they knew what to do, how to go through that 11-hour surgery that I underwent. Trust is all a part of this somehow. But I also believe that hope comes with intention, effort, and what I think of as dirt under the fingernails. I don't know how many of you recognize that experience of working hard in the garden and you're wearing gloves coming in and saying, oh yeah, look, dirt under the fingernails. Now, being somebody who's had cancer twice and living in a body that is really very different than the one I was born into, I also know that hope can require effort. Hope can be work. It can be work in several ways. Hope can be elicited by doing what I can in the moment so that the possibility of that desired outcome is more likely. Accessing resources to give good outcomes a bigger chance. Now, our brains, this is a brain, are designed to peer into the future. We have these grand frontal lobes. Those are the part of the brain that is illuminated here, lit up. And these frontal lobes are really important. They're very much a part of being human. They allow us to plan, anticipate, and imagine things. And really, the future is one of our favorite places to go. There's nothing wrong with that. I think a big part of the pleasure of a vacation is in the anticipation, the research, the organizing. That can be a big part of the enjoyment. We also have the ability to imagine the future and to rehearse it in difficult situations. Not only do our frontal lobes create a plan A, but often a plan B, C, D, etc. How many times, how many times have I gone for a regular checkup with one of my oncologists and imagined getting bad news, planned for it, anticipated it, and all of those visits, how many have been difficult? Well, some, yes, of course, but by no means all of them. I've used up a lot of energy preparing myself for bad news, and how I'd love to have some of that energy back. Maybe another way of allowing hope or encouraging hope is fostering a more spacious internal conversation. What about being prepared for good news? What about marking that, noting it, celebrating it? I just had several appointments, and in celebration, I bought a couple of hostas to put into the garden. And it's my little bid for the future. It's my little bit of gratitude. It's my little bit of appreciation to take that moment and allow it to sink in, and to remind my frontal lobes that they're not always right. They're noisy, but they're not always right. And that I can use different techniques to bring myself away from the chatter in the frontal lobes that is preparing to rehearse bad news, and allow myself to ponder the possibilities of good news, or that sense that I'll be okay regardless. And so affirmations, I used not to be a big fan of affirmations, but I think when they're realistic and when they really reflect who we are, they can be really helpful. Something for our frontal lobes to hold on to and to repeat to ourselves. I don't think my affirmations are terribly wildly positive. They tend to be things like, I'm going to be okay. Whatever happens, I'm okay. Whatever happens, I'm okay. And I often join that with something like a repetition of what we call in the healing journey, the divine light invocation, imaging light flowing through my body, sensing the peace that is possible. So imagery can be a big part of that, and not the imagery that's rehearsing. This is not the rehearsal imagery. People who say to me, oh, I'm no good at imaging, I'll often say, well, can you worry? Do you know how to worry? Because worry is imagery. It's just imagining things that are frightening and unpleasant. And that's usually the work of those frontal lobes trying to protect us by offering us the opportunity to rehearse. But we can change that up. I remember in early days, I used to place photographs of healing places in my book. I would take a book with me to the waiting room, and in it, I would slide photographs in so that it looked like I was reading, but in actual fact, I was enjoying placing myself elsewhere. I very frequently journal in waiting rooms. I find that really helpful. It gives my frontal lobes a place to say, all right, she's heard us. I can calm down now. I don't have to keep repeating it. I had an extraordinary experience once in a waiting room. Somebody leaned over, a gentleman leaned over and said, are you journaling? He actually kind of looked over into my book, and I said, yes, I'm journaling. You should try it. Get your own. I think he was just curious. Self-talk. Self-talk is like that internal coach. We can inculcate and encourage that coaching voice inside of us. You might make it the image of somebody that you know or some kindly person in your life, but talking yourself through the other possibilities as well, like, I can cope with this. I've done this before. I'm feeling well. I'm okay. Deep breathing is obviously my go-to place. And last year I had an MRI, and the technician told me he was going to be watching the breathing cycle and taking scans at specific points in the breath cycle. Now, I'm not super with a confined space and loud noises. And so in the MRI, I use my breathing to ground myself. I experience the breath in all its minutest details, the way it flows in through my nostrils, rolls around the back of my throat, how my body expands, and then contracts and releases the breath, and I let the breath roll all the way out. I don't shut it down too quickly. And so that's kind of like enjoying my breathing, not taking it for granted. And so I used my breathing as I usually do. And when it was over, the tech greeted me, and he looked a little frustrated. He told me he'd never seen anybody breathe so slowly, and that the scan would have been done sooner if I was breathing more normally. So you kind of win some and you lose some, but I would never let go of my breath as a way of coping. Finally, we can be really active in promoting our images of the future that we want. We as Wellspring members will know exactly what I mean here. We can be active participants in our present, which will help us in the future. These are some of the pictures that would be familiar to you. This is Wellspring, right? And I'm so delighted that Wellspring has been so adept at shifting to cope with COVID, because I don't think I've noticed much of a slowdown in any of our programs. And even more delightedly, we get to interact with people across the country. And I think that's really exciting. So what can we do to be active in creating our hope? Well, we can make informed decisions about our treatment. We can rehearse, we can ask, or sorry, not rehearse, research. We can ask questions, or we can have somebody else take on that role. When I was on chemo, it was my mom who did the research online to see what would help me cope better with various drugs, who knew that frozen grapes were excellent for mouth sores. I couldn't bear to look up the research. That's part of my job, and I just couldn't go there. But my mom, she was very happy to be given that task. Keeping up with our self-care is really, really critical in encouraging hope. Using self-soothing strategies, learning how to self-soothe. Part of that is encouraging a kindly, warm, encouraging voice, but it can also be yoga and tai chi and qigong and exercise. Self-soothing comes in the form of walking, of, well, for me, gardening shows. I've become a real fan of Gardener's World, BBC. It is something that really soothes me. Even in midwinter, when you're watching in England, their daffodils come up and I'm watching the snowfall. It still gives me a sense of soothing, of being in the garden, even though I'm not, breathing deeply. Engaging in exercise, keeping ourselves fit, I think is really important. Not just because it's good for our bodies, but it's a way of releasing pent-up energy and stress. It literally transforms the chemistry of stress into our bodies and lets us let it go. We're probably, I've often said this, the only mammals that experience a stress response when strapped in a chair. Thinking of driving, the average tiger doesn't experience it that way. When a tiger is stressed, it moves, it roars, it runs, it fights, it releases the chemistry. Human beings don't do that often enough. Not that we should be fighting, but maybe we should be exercising, releasing it. Journaling, support groups, and a psychotherapist perhaps experienced in cancer. I think that's very important. The issues that surround cancer need to be integrated into your experience. And so having somebody who understands that is, I think, really important. But all of these sources, journaling and support groups as well, are a part of expressing the feelings that we're experiencing. Rather than bundling them into our emotional knapsack, we're taking them out and letting them go. It's a way to acknowledge the feelings without necessarily being stuck in them. I think that asking for what we need is particularly important. I have too often heard people say things like, I really hope my son comes to visit me. And I'll ask, have you asked him to? And I'm so surprised at how many people practice this sort of telepathy or mind reading, that they are sending vibes out, please come and visit. But they don't actually turn around and say, would you please come and see me? It would really be helpful. To me, that is shifting hope into action. And it's, I think, very important. Eating well, seeing friends, seeking support, and so very powerful is being with others who understand what it is you're feeling and going through. So what can we say about hope? This has just been a little meditation, I think, on hope. I've just been sort of exploring it in my own life and in my work. And I've come to the conclusion that hope is not one thing, that hope is actually many things. And different people will be attracted to different ways of experiencing hope. But I do know how it feels. And it seems to have this in common amongst people. It's a feeling of spaciousness, which brings with it a sense of peace that actually feels like possibilities. There are more possibilities available to me than my busy frontal lobes will allow me. And we can learn to foster it. I'm not sure what your connection is to that sense of peace. Many of us will describe nature, pets, animals, music, people, friends, loved ones, Wellspring. We want to learn how to foster, understand what hope means to us, and then find ways of fostering it. And sometimes, yeah, I think it requires trust. Not trust absolute, but trust that has been gained and deserved. So we're not trusting some unchallenged form. We are trusting in something that has a track record, that we see some evidence for trust. So if you have a physician that you feel you can communicate with well, as somebody who's skilled at what they do, they're not always warm and fuzzy. There are other places to get that. But that skill, that sense of knowing where to go and what to do, if you have a relationship like that with your physician, maybe a little bit of trust has been earned, and then that's a good thing. And if you're working with someone where trust has not formed, or the trust that you had has been unfulfilled, I think changing doctors is a perfectly reasonable approach, because that's self-care. We don't want to just blithely hope that he or she will change. That's very unlikely. But we can move on and find care that fits our needs better. And so hope can require some work with dirt under the fingernails. It can require concrete, active steps to give hope a helping hand, like finding a right physician or doing some research into treatment. And then ironically and paradoxically, it can also require letting go and not trying to control things. I spent a lot of time thinking about that paradox, that it gets tangled in trust, but it's a sense of I do what I can, and then I stop. I trust that that's enough. Maybe that's what it's about. And everyone's going to have different tolerances for that. And everyone's going to have a different relationship with that. So these aren't rules. These are explorations. And sometimes hope comes in the form, I think, of gratitude. And when we share and express that, it brings forward more spaciousness, more peace, maybe more possibility in the situation. So it's complex, it's paradoxical, and with or without feathers, to play on Emily Dickinson, I believe that hope is always possible. I've seen it in very extreme circumstances, particularly when people have a chance to process what's happening. I like to think that hope travels with us. And this picture seemed to capture that sense for me. I hope it does for you too. I can't wait to hear what you have to say about hope, and whether anything that we've talked about or that I've explored here has meaning for you and that has been helpful.